Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you back to another episode of Optica, Reflective Faith and Latinidad. And I assure you, you don't want to miss this series. It's a series that's near and dear to my heart and probably to a lot of people who listen to Optica week after week. While we do that, we want to remind you that we're inviting you to open your eyes to see what God is doing. So what's the topic in this series? The topic is church cultures that foster narcissism. Church cultures that foster narcissism. Why is this important? It's because perhaps you, certainly people we've received emails and texts from, people we've met with in pastoral counseling, have been victims of narcissism. And one of the things they often tell me and Jeanette is, we didn't even realize it. We couldn't tell narcissism when it was staring us right in the face. And hopefully this series will help us identify narcissism and identify those ingredients that help cultivate, incubate, and foster narcissism in churches, in organizations, in parachurch organizations. And above all, leads us to be self-reflective when we have narcissistic tendencies that can be harmful to ourselves and the people we lead and the people we love. And so I invite you to take out your cup of coffee or tea or water and take out a pen, paper, or your iPhone, wherever you take notes, to reflect with us together on church cultures that foster narcissism. First, I want to tell you that we need to define it. And I want to thank Mayo Clinic. I did a research at Mayo Clinic about narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. And here are a few things that might be helpful if you think you're in a toxic culture that foster narcissism. According to the Mayo Clinic, this NPD is a manifestation of an unreasonably high sense of our own importance. An unreasonably high sense of our own importance. Scripture warns us against this when Paul writes that none of us should have a higher concept of ourselves than we ought. And actually, he tells us that if we're true leaders, servant leaders, we should deem others higher than we deem ourselves. And so narcissism, especially among leaders in parachurch organizations, in congregations, in large organizations, is manifest in certain ways. There are symptoms that telltale signs like that leader needs and seeks a lot of attention. Undue affirmation. They need to be constantly affirmed and celebrated. That leader or that person lacks the ability to understand or care about the feelings of others. It's all about himself or herself. And so imagine a person that needs undue affirmation, always needs to be celebrated. And let's be clear, we all need affirmation. It's a human need. It's part of kind of Bloom's taxonomy of human needs. But it's this undue, incessant hunger to be affirmed and to be celebrated above others. Tie that with the lack of ability to have empathy, to feel and care about the feelings of others. Another symptom that the Mayo Clinic tells us is that the narcissistic leader, he or she thinks that they deserve privileges and special treatment above everybody else. You know, I deserve the best parking space. I deserve to be addressed with deference above everybody else. When we think that we deserve privileges and we deserve accolades and special treatment above other people, we begin to establish ourselves as more important. That's not just bad. The flip side of that is we begin to treat people as less important. So what happens in the narcissistic leader? He or she believes that they are superior to others. And watch this. They begin to isolate themselves from everybody else because they think they've deceived themselves to think that they can only spend time with special people. Only special people understand me. Everybody else, the quotidian people, the run-of-the-mill people, they're not in my special group. I have to hang around special people. Totally contrary to the gospel. In the gospel, there are no special people. In the gospel, we are all loved equally and have equal value. And now some people might take a text out of its context for a pretext to feed their ego. take a text out of its context for a pretext to feed your ego. And they might say, well, Scripture says that the minister is worthy of double honor. In the context of Scripture, it's talking about honor that is deeply cemented in mutuality, the mutual honor. It's not that the leader, or the pastor, or the minister is of greater value. It's within a culture of mutuality. The other thing that the narcissistic personality disorder manifests, and you'll see this a lot in churches, is that person thinks they deserve special favors, special accommodations. They expect other people to do what they want without questioning. Did you hear that? Narcissism manifests itself when people expect you to do what they want without the freedom to question. Another thing is they brag a lot. It's one of my favorite phrases, they're deeply self-referential. They refer to themselves and their accomplishments and their travels and they name drop. And so when you begin to see some of these, and there's a whole lot of other signs, but that's just a few. When you begin to see these signs, there should be a red flag. An alarm should go off and say, hey, am I dealing with a narcissistic leader who is just using me to reach their personal goals and their personal ambitions? Does this leader, whoever he or she is, do they reflect the character and the humility of Jesus Christ? You remember Jesus teaching us. He says, learn of me, because I am meek and lowly of heart. And so humility is a sign of being Christ-like. And so when people seek special favors, undue accolades, when they treat others as inferior to themselves, when they exploit others, when they expect you to do things without questioning, without examining, without the freedom to think for yourself, red flags. Alarms should go off. Another thing that the narcissistic leader may have trouble with is questioning or criticism. They become unduly angry when they receive a question that might say, but where's that coming from? A genuine question. If you are a leader whose heart is to honor God and serve others, you should open yourself to questions. It's okay for people to think differently than you do, than I do. We are not absolute. We make mistakes. And so when a person becomes unduly irate because he or she has received criticism, or that person feels easily slighted, it could be that they are wrestling with narcissism. And here's the thing. It's not just that we have narcissistic leaders. With many thanks, and I'm going to reference some books here that'll go deeper in this. Diane Langberg, the Christian psychologist, has written extensively on some of this. Of course, you might remember there are a bunch of books that came out in 2020. Chuck DeGroot, in his book, When Narcissism Comes to the Church. Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer in a book called A Church Called Tove. And Wade Mullen, a book called Something's Not Right. All of those books came out in 2020. There was a lot of crises in leadership in the church in 2020, as there has been in every generation, but a lot around kind of toxic narcissism. And all of them begin to examine not just why there are narcissistic leaders, like I just outlined in my kind of 30,000-foot overview of the Mayo Clinic, but why are there churches that allow it? What is it in certain cultures that allow for narcissism to flourish? What are the things that open the doors to narcissism? Well, let me enumerate a few, and maybe this will help you. Number one, no questioning. There's no room for questions. Everything is like ex cathedra, like it comes directly from the throne of God. You're not free to ask a question. And I don't mean being a contrarian. I mean genuinely asking questions, seeking to understand why certain decisions are made. When there's a culture that doesn't allow for questioning, we need to be aware that this may be a culture that fosters narcissistic leadership. The second thing is blind allegiance. let me be clear. Loyalty is a good thing. Loyalty is a good virtue. You should be loyal to your spouse. You should be loyal to your family. But blind allegiance is not loyalty. We cannot be, as the phrase goes, loyal to a fault. And so when something or someone, some culture or some person, some leader does something that is wrong, loyalty should not require us to go along with that wrong thing, with that unethical behavior. And sometimes, because of classical biblical teachings on submission and authority, which are good, there's a place for biblical understandings of authority and biblical understandings of submission. But biblical understandings and teachings of authority and submission are not a license, nor are they an endorsement of blind allegiance. Whatever the pastor says, whatever the leader says, because when people go astray, we should not follow them. Paul himself tells us this. You be an imitator of me as long as I am an imitator of Christ. Paul's not saying imitate everything he does. When Paul did something that was not imitating Christ, you're free to not follow. And so that second thing of blind loyalty, tied on to no questioning, creates a culture and foments a culture of narcissism, where people are not free to think, act, innovate. The third thing is a culture that gives special privileges with a double ethical standard. Special privileges with a double ethical standard. Now, you might ask, what do you mean? What does Optica mean when they talk about special privileges with a double ethical standard? Sometimes when we're in leadership, and I'm a pastor and I lead a national coalition, people think that because you're in a higher level position, you're free to do things others are not. That is not the gospel. The gospel has the same standard for every follower of Christ, the same spiritual, moral, and ethical standard. If anything, if you're in leadership, you should hold yourself to a higher ethical standard. And sometimes in these conversations, you hear people say, well, I'm free from that because I'm in a level of leadership. And the danger of thinking you're free from ethical standards because you have a special privilege in leadership leads to narcissistic leaders that abuse. The fourth thing is weak accountability or no accountability, sometimes called lack of accountability. When leaders surround themselves with people who are just yes men and yes women, if I surround myself with leaders who are just yes men and yes women, I'm setting myself up to be open to narcissistic tendencies and practices and abuse my authority. In Shakespeare, in his work, Julius Caesar, there's an advice that's given to Caesar, a very kind of evil advice, if you ask me. He says, hey, he's advising Caesar on his leadership, and he says to him, surround yourself by weak men, men that don't think. I'm paraphrasing Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And he says, there's a man there who thinks too much. Such men are dangerous. The opposite should be true of Christian leadership. Christian leaders should surround themselves by people who think on their own, who are not just yes men and yes women, who are not just rubber stamps on everything we think. A lack of accountability often manifests in nepotism, often manifests in bringing people into your inner circle who do not have the same level of experience or the same level of expertise, so that your expertise goes beyond question. That should raise a red flag. And so you might ask yourself, Pastor Gabe, why are you talking about narcissism in the church? I'll tell you why. The devastating impact on families, on congregations, on mission and vision, and above all, the credibility of the gospel of Jesus Christ. When the world and people in the church see leaders who claim to follow Christ, but have a leadership style incompatible with the ethic of Jesus and the character of Jesus, it hurts our Christian witness. And so today I want to invite you to read the books by Diane Landberg and Chuck DeGroot and Wade Mullen and Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer and many more that you'll probably see in our footnotes somewhere, so that you can be informed about the dangers of narcissism in leadership and the dangers of narcissism for the Christian family. Next week, we'll talk about the devastating impacts and how we can avoid them. Thanks for joining Optica, Reflective Faith and Latinidad. Until the next time, inviting you to open your eyes and see what God is doing.